So we're in your United States history book, and we're in chapter 27, section 3, and we were talking about communism in Asia, the Cold War going on. So now we focused first on Korea and the Korean War, but now we're going to talk about what was going on in China, the Chinese dilemma, communism in China. The 1930s Chinese communists under Mao Zedong, it's a picture of him here, waged civil war against the Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek. In 1937, Japanese invasion of China was going on, and so both groups then fought against Japan in World War II. And then Japan's defeat in World War II then basically brought this old civil war back into being. And the conflict resumed between the communists and the nationalists. The Soviet Union, Russia, supported Mao Zedong. And General Marshall, our Secretary of State during this time, traveled to China to try to unite these two, to try to unite Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong into a peace, some kind of a peace treaty. But he could not do that. They both refused. They were total conflict in ideologies. They would not cooperate. One was basically full-on communist. The other was full-on free enterprise. And so his peace talks would not work at all. Here's a picture. These are actually pictures of the fighting going on in communist China at that time. These are the nationalists here and just trying to hold out against Mao Zedong. He was very ruthless. I mean, he actually killed, 15 million people in trying to bring forth communism, starved people, and just very ugly. Let's just say that. Very ugly things. The United States abandons nationalist China. So this is a sad point in our history too. The Soviets withdrew from Manchuria, leaving a base in arms for the Chinese communists. So here we have, Manchuria was part of China, so the Soviets withdrew and basically left arms, weapons, and everything for the Chinese communists. So the Chinese communists became stronger in dominion. And of course, Secretary of State Marshall returned to the United States after he had gone and tried to make peace there and recommended the withdrawal of all American troops from China because he was dissatisfied with Chiang's national government too, and basically thought the United States should keep out of this civil war going on in China. Without the support of the United States, the nationalist government forces of Chiang Kai-shek were overwhelmed by the communists who were fully armed by the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union came in arming the Mao Zedong and his communists, and so Chiang Kai-shek, they had to retreat. So on December 1949, the communists had forced Chiang Kai-shek and about 2 million nationalist soldiers with their families to withdraw to the island of Formosa. And Formosa now today is Taiwan. So as you can see, you can't really see, it's a tiny island on the edge of China. And so they withdrew their families there. In fact, let's see if you can see a picture here. If they have it, nationalist Taiwan is right here. Here's all of big China. Here's where they went on the small island of Taiwan. And it's still, still an island of that's non-communist at this point, as China is communist. So here we have Chiang Kai-shek, and actually this is FDR, I think, in that point, and Winston Churchill. We have him in the midst of World War II, standing with America, but we pretty much deserted him. We'll find out more about this in just a little bit here. Chinese crisis. So in 1954, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government removed its troops and civilians closer to Formosa. They also possessed the fortified islands of Kinmen and Matsu from 3 to 10 miles off the Chinese mainland. In 1958, the Chinese communists began bombing the islands violently, and they announced a 12-mile territorial limit, including the islands. So they started bombing Formosa, bombing, well, Kinmen and Matsu, those islands that were controlled by nationalist Chiang Kai-shek. President Eisenhower responded to the Red Chinese, declaring there will be no retreat in the face of armed aggression. So the Soviets responded that an attack on communist China by the United States would be construed as an attack upon the Soviet Union, and we would be in war with Russia, right? So he says, if you come in and attack China, Russia and China are going to come up against America. So the president ordered a buildup of American forces in the Formosa Strait, that's where Taiwan is now, and the national troops on Kinmen and Matsu to receive supplies. So Eisenhower said, we're going to be giving them supplies. We're giving them guns. We're going to get them supplies, which he did. And the United Nations did stand behind Eisenhower. And so then when the United Nations came and stood behind Eisenhower instead of behind China, the Red Chinese temporarily announced a ceasefire and said, okay, we're going to cease fire here. But they turned and launched more attacks in Tibet and supported attempts to take over Laos and forcibly to seize territory on the north border of India. So they were just out. Mao Zedong was out. Like, we're going to attack India. We're going to attack Laos. We're going to attack Tibet. You know, they started attacking other areas now with their communist government. So we have here, he announced a ceasefire for a while, but we have now Chiang Kai-shek and his guys in Taiwan. Nixon's visit to China. So this is another thing, you know. So let's talk about, so President Nixon now. Remember we have in Korea we have Eisenhower, you know, and then from Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson and now to Nixon. So this is down the road a little bit, you know. So Nixon now basically says, you know, I'm going to see if we can become friends with China, communist China. So communist China began gaining recognition during the Nixon administration. And the age of détente means, you know, getting along. You know, détente means being at peace and getting along with each other. So the age of détente was symbolized by President Nixon's goodwill tour of Red China in 1972, which opened trade with China. So Nixon and Secretary of State Kissinger, his Secretary of State, we talked about him already, believed that cooperation between the United States and Red China would weaken the Soviet Union's influence in the world. So we were still in the Cold War of communism with the Soviet Union. Says, well, if we can get on China's side, and this will weaken the communist Russia, right? So international bankers and large corporations were eager to trade with Red China now, despite the risk of strengthening the communist government. So Nixon's visit set the stage for future relations and trade and military planning with Red China. So Nixon comes and you can see here, he's going visiting China. Here's him and his wife, Nixon, and Pat Nixon with all in China. Here they're at the wall of China visiting as like tourists almost here. And here he's, here's Kissinger, basically them having dinner with, you know, the Chinese officials. And here's a picture of Mao Zedong, or at that time, you know, so Nixon and Mao hold surprise hour-long talk. So everybody's kind of cheering. But when you think of this, you think, wow, are we really supporting communism then? And what they're doing over there to all these people was very horrific, you know? Diplomatic relations, Carter's betrayal of Taiwan. So now it's going into president from Nixon to Carter. So it was Nixon, then he, of course, resigned under the Watergate scandal, and then Ford became president. Now we have President Carter. And so in 1979, President Carter finished the work begun by Nixon and Kissinger by an agreement to establish diplomatic relationships with communist China. To appease Red China, the United States recognized the communists as the legitimate government of China. So in 1971, decision had been made to expel Taiwanese government from the UN. So many Americans believe this was a final step in betrayal of free China. Carter also called for the removal of the United States troops for Thailand, the Philippines, South Korea, and Japan. Although Congress rejected his plan, not totally rejecting the total plan, but Carter continued his policy of appeasement and remained reluctant to contain communism. So Carter was like, okay, let's get along with China. But the bad thing is that, we basically went in, and Carter called for the removal of troops, but also from Thailand and Philippines and all this too, which did not happen. So he was basically doing all these things for appeasement. But he, in 1971, to expel Taiwan government from the UN. So Taiwan government that had been under Chiang Kai-shek, the government of Taiwan, which was a democracy, was democratic, was in the UN. And since the communist China came into the UN, they wouldn't come in unless it got rid of them. And so they made Taiwan leave the UN, the United Nations. How sickening, right? It just, to me, it's like, oh, it says Nixon screwed Taiwan. Yeah, here we have, yes, but is Taiwan really a country? They're saying, oh, Taiwan's not really a country. So just what they did is that laughing, China's laughing and saying, well, we got rid of Taiwan. Okay, let's stop there. And then we're going to get into the next video on Asia. That's going to be totally on the Vietnam War.